Hello again. So if you watched my shorter video, this one's going to be more in-depth on the book review, and that's going to be the format that I try to stick with for a while. So this is also the first of its kind for this video, a little bit more in-depth book analysis. There's going to be a lot of trial and error in how I do these, so you're going to get the raw first attempt, and book 2 will be a new attempt. So the book is Rethinking Suicide, Why Prevention Fails and How We Can Do Better by Craig J. Bryan. If you watched the last video, the quick summary was very good and very approachable. So one of the things I did, taking notes, and we'll see how well this translates into me going back and forth. At this moment, I'm not doing a lot of edits and cuts to make this look smooth and seamless. Over time, that might be the case, but I have with me a couple pages, about 4.5 pages of notes that were a pretty big deal for me as I was reading it, and I'm like, yep, I want to keep that in mind, I want to keep that in mind, I want to keep that in mind. A bit of a refresher if you didn't watch the other video. This is a psychologist who, I don't think he's still involved, but for sure started his career in psych in the military and working with a lot of active military, and you get a lot of his experience with the suicidality and how that looked with people there, and a lot of his back and forth on trying to figure out what caused people to try to take their life in the military, because we've seen this as a huge issue. Suicide rates among veterans is bad, and there were a lot of different beliefs on that. A huge one was just being sent away, and one of the things, and I might come across it later, but one of the things that really stood out to me was a lot of his research. They just couldn't find strong evidence that showed that it was for sure being deployed that caused an increase in suicidality, because there'd be people that had multiple deployments and were still fine. If I come across it through here, I'll reiterate it exactly, but the way that I understood it was there were certain factors that when exposed to them in war, your chances of suicidality went up. So it is possible, for instance, for someone to be deployed 5 times and never be involved in a friendly fire incident where they kill someone maybe that they know, or at least on their side. That is very possible, to have multiple deployments and never have that happen. However, it's also possible on your first deployment, the first time you get into combat, you shoot someone on your side and you know you did it, and you see them, and you have to live with the fact that that person doesn't get to go home because you killed them. That is very hard. That would be traumatic for most people. So, and I'm not using that as an explicit example he used, but my point is that there are specific experiences that can increase the chances of suicidality. And as this story progresses, as the book progresses, and to be clear, this is completely nonfiction. I'm a very narrative storytelling type person, so saying things like, as the story progresses, it's a true book, and it's not even like meant to be, oh, it's a true story. It's research on suicide and understanding it. But as the book unfolds, to put it that way, we do learn that there is a lot more to do with self-care and how we have managed our lives in terms of taking care of our general health from a mental perspective. Things that we all know are useful, things that I've talked about: sleep, exercise, community of people, rest, doing things healthily to yourself. Now, when big traumatic events come in, we will fall back on whatever we have, and if it's not enough, we'll fall through that very often. So a really traumatic incident might mean you don't have as good of a support system as you thought you did, or as you now need. It might have been perfectly fine for what you needed at the time, and now it just doesn't work. So there's a lot of that. So I might be doing some pause and play now that I think about it with this. So those are some of my initial thoughts there, just as a quick summary, and I'm going to kind of break down a lot of his points kind of chapter by chapter and some of the key details there. So the introduction of the book, the key takeaway from the start of this book and the intro to everything going on is that there is still more study and more trainings that need to be done in this field. So study on the research part, and then more suicide training in general. A lot of the things that were pointed out there are built-in assumptions that are very likely wrong about suicidality and the world they're in. So one of the examples is, from my field, for instance, if I were to have someone come in with depression and I'm using anxiety intervention to help them, it might be useful, but I'm not actually applying the right thing to them. So even though my intervention might be good, maybe I'm the best at it, if I start from the wrong premise and the wrong assumption, they're not going to get the help that they need. Similar if, a woman who's 8 weeks pregnant goes to the doctor and is talking about how she's feeling, and the doctor starts from a place of her not being pregnant and maybe does a little bit of gaslighting and doesn't believe that she's pregnant, then the approach that the doctor is taking now is wrong, because there's a big piece of information, the fact that that person is carrying a baby, that is going to completely derail what they're trying to do. And that's part of the idea here, is that making sure that when we approach suicidality, we understand what we're addressing. And he makes arguments here and later that this is not necessarily a mental illness issue so much as we'll put it as a less understood issue. And the point being there is that general mental health and mental illness interventions don't help the way that they should, which can lead to an understandable conclusion that maybe this isn't quite right to say that suicidality is mental illness, but it might be something else going on. And so a lot of argument done here that amps up the rest of the book of trying to look at things from a different perspective and see what are we missing about the understanding of suicide, because we're missing a lot. And so he uses a lot of metaphors and a lot of different ways to try to conceptualize how we could be looking at this wrong and to really get the ball rolling in terms of understanding what's to come for the story. Okay, continuing into chapter 1. One of the things, and there's going to be a little bit of repetition from what I've said before, but despite increases in mental health understanding, military suicide rates have struggled to really come down, and this leads well into so much of this book of the misunderstanding that we have about what suicidality really is, especially for the military community, but not exclusively. Another piece there is that it's not quite confirmed that this is 100% related to PTSD, that because you have PTSD, you're going to kill yourself, or if you die by suicide, that's because you have PTSD. It is more complex than that, and so there's a strong argument here to not do immediate correlation causation points or make, again, continued assumptions about what is going on with people when they follow through on suicide just because they were in the military, just because they were having this experience or this background in their life. These assumptions aren't particularly helpful. They're useful to create an inquisitive mind, to create curiosity, but it might not be that that is why. Even if there's a lot of people in that group that are more likely to follow through on suicide, that doesn't mean it is because of that group. And it's also important to note that a lot of military, and I made a note of this because I think he says it. Yeah. So suicides are almost exclusively a result of self-inflicted gunshot wounds for deployed military personnel. They all have guns. The accessibility is there. It's easier to do it. This is going to lean more into when we talk about impulsivity, of having that moment of it just comes up. And a lot of people who survive suicide will say they don't know what came over them. So if you have a flooded moment, you have access to a gun and you kill yourself, that is different than if you have access to pills, even a knife, or you don't have access to anything and then you come off that extreme moment. But people who are carrying weapons and they're in a certain environment, there might be a higher proclivity to, one, hit that point, and two, be able to fully follow through on it. And those are important things to keep in mind. I said before that they found that the deployment rate doesn't seem to have any connection to suicide, but the specifically different piece, which again I said this before, is that witnessing death and killing other people, that does seem to have a correlation to suicide rate. And the more times you deploy, the more likely you are to have one of those experiences, witnessing death or killing. Which I know that those sound the same, but watching someone die is not the same as being the one that caused their death. Those are different things. So anyone who's done either one of those things could tell you that those are different. So experiencing those two things, and then especially in combat, like sitting with someone on hospice can be traumatic and watching them take their last breath, but watching your friend get shot or watching a child get bombed or something like that, these are different than, I think we get where I'm going. So those are more likely to be factors than just simply being deployed, if that makes sense. So he also goes on to talk about how we don't really know exactly why people pick the days and times that they do. Again, this will lead more into the impulsivity here later. But he makes an argument that a lot of suicide understanding is based on confirmation biases, and that researchers in general need to practice productive stupidity, which I like that word a lot, that phrase. And he described that as essentially being willing to look stupid and uncertain while researching new or out of the ordinary solutions, thinking outside the box. And I think this is really healthy, obviously, as long as it doesn't come at the expense of bad experiments on humans, but being able to try different things in a healthy and safe way. So chapter 2, titled The 90% Statistic, goes into the said statistic, which is that 90% of suicidal victims and or attempts, doesn't mean they completed, that's important, 90% of suicides and attempts are by people who currently have mental health illnesses. I said before that he makes an argument this isn't to be viewed exclusively as mental illness, and we'll keep going into that as we go through, but that statistic is there. Again, proper mental health care and self-care routines are shown to reduce suicide rates in patients. So taking care of your mental health and having appropriate mental health care routines and self-care routines do show a reduction in suicide rates, which is fantastic and really important for everyone. There's never anything I've seen that shows the opposite. Like, being mentally healthy and appropriate self-care is exclusively beneficial in everything that I've seen so far. It's a consistently backed up stat, to put it that way. So just keeping that in mind. One of the things that he showed, which we talked about before about the impulsivity, is a lot of people will make comments like, I don't know what came over me. But all of these individuals will report having had heightened life stress concurrent with the timing of their attempts. They'll have moments of intense mental or emotional stress. So there's intensity already there, and then they hit extra intensity, and then make an attempt, and then say, I don't know what came over me. But when you look at that stress trajectory and just the intensity on their mental and emotional health at the moment, it starts to paint a clear picture of why self-care might reduce and mental health care might reduce, because your ability to delay a spike in emotional and mental stress can thus result in a lowered chance of a suicide attempt, especially from impulsivity, because your ability to emotionally regulate and manage space is better. You're less likely to hit that spike. So chapter 3 is a little bit more involved and has a little bit more of that. I'm not going to spend a ton of time in it, but I'll just jump in. So one of the things I mentioned earlier, and he says again here, and I'm going to read it as I wrote it down, but that if mental health care reduces mental illness symptomology and suicidality is considered a mental health issue or illness, then in theory we should see similar reductions in suicidality as we do with other mental health illnesses when care is provided. But we do not. And that's the takeaway, that we don't see those similar reductions. So there's something else going on. And some of the attributions he gives to that are misdiagnosis being an issue as a general problem in mental health. Also in general, mental health professionals needing to use more assessment tools which is true. I know a lot of schools do not teach how to use assessment tools, and frankly, there aren't a lot of places to go to learn about that. I can't even off the top of my head think of where I would go to learn more training, to get more training on assessment tools. So these, at least in my experience, are very real issues as well. He does make a point that's, in my experience, very true as well, that diagnostic approach is skewed because of insurance and job reimbursements and things like that incentivize therapists to treat normal emotional responses as mental illness. 100%. The states and insurances that require a mental illness diagnosis are causing more harm than good, just to be blunt. That should not be a requirement. You do not have to be mentally ill to go to therapy. People who are coming in are not always ill. Therapy can be a very preventative engagement, just like going to any doctor can be, going to any healthcare professional can be. So requiring that person leaves with a mental illness diagnosis to get insurance reimbursement or for some jobs to say is actually helpful is not based on anything that's true. And it does wrongly incentivize therapists to find a diagnosis that will fit instead of just treating the patient as they are needed to be treated. And that's a little bit of my passion coming out there too, but it is something he points out. So, and that leads into him saying that suicide is something being caused by mental illness is currently based on faulty assumptions and research. I will also say that even though I love this book, the point of these isn't to say like this person's right about everything. This is just a general summary of what he's saying. I encourage everyone to read the book, take through their own lens of suicide experience. Most people have some connection with suicide. At the very least, that might be experience with suicidal ideation, whether self or others, self-harm or completed actions. So, this can hit on different levels for a lot of different people. So he also mentioned that psychological autopsies have seemingly fallen victim to a confirmation bias and circular reasoning from the perspective that assumes mental illness is behind suicidal behavior. One of the other interesting things, he starts to get into numbers of it, which I like, and he does specify that mental illness is not unrelated. So that means mental illness is often related. He's not making an argument that people who are making suicide attempts are mentally healthy. I said before, 90% of people who make the attempts have a mental illness. The argument is that this is a separate thing. It's a comorbidity. It's existing with the mental illness. It is not the mental illness. Depression isn't the suicidality. People who are depressed don't always kill themselves. People who kill themselves aren't always depressed. They're similar co-occurring things at times, but they do not automatically mean the other, is a big point of that. And there are certain people who will make attempts or complete suicide without showing signs of mental illness. So one interesting statistic among a couple that I'm going to share is that on average about 50 to 80% of suicide victims talk to others about their desires before they follow through. That's not a lot. And he did specify that the number is likely closer to 57 to 60% of people. So I'm going to say it again. 57 to 60% or 50 to 80% of suicide victims talk to others about their desires before they follow through. That's a large percent that won't say anything. And this can be part of the reason, why some of us are like, I don't know why I didn't see it coming. There might not have been as many signs as we think. So asking someone if they're having thoughts or feelings about killing themselves or wanting to die is often a helpful earlier intervention. It's not something that we usually, and we learn this in school too, you're not going to plant the thought of death in someone's mind, generally speaking. So asking is very often a safe question. Obviously, you don't just want to frequently be asking people if they're feeling that way. That's going to get annoying, but it's often okay to ask in a healthy, concerned way. So he laid out 9 warning signs. I am going to read these, and I hope they don't make you be like, oh, I'm that. These don't mean you are, but they are signs that you probably need to start working on your mental health and increase your self-care and address some of these more head-on. But the warning signs are talking about wanting to die or killing yourself, looking for a way to end one's life, increased alcohol or drug use, withdrawing from others, hopelessness, sleeping too much or too little, feeling anxious or agitated, feeling trapped, and feeling anger, rage, or wanting revenge. So try to reduce those things. Try not to have those things coming up. And if you see people in your life that are starting to exhibit more of those, as I said before, asking about their overall well-being and suicidality might not be a bad idea. So another incredible study that was done on EHRs, which are electronic health records. It was done on one specific one where they analyzed all of the client notes consisting of over 80,000 patients. And this showed that individuals who reported having suicidal thoughts on a daily basis had only a 0.3% chance of actually dying by suicide over the next year. Of 80,000 people, the ones who had thoughts of suicide daily, only 0.3% would actually die by suicide over the next year. So just keep in mind that number. This is a prevalent issue, but a lot more people have the thoughts than actually will die by it. This is almost the same number as people who never report having thoughts. This is incredible information to me. Now, he does say that overall attempts in suicidal people are higher, but successful suicides have about the same percentage rate for people who think about it every day and have talked about it than people who never talk about it at all. So again, this is not something you can just easily predict through conversation. So yeah, and this is such a dense chapter with a lot of really good data in it. Another really interesting piece of data is they found that people were more willing to share that they were suicidal or having suicidal thoughts when they knew they weren't going to be followed up on. That's a tough one to handle, but a lot of people don't want that overload of info, so people are more likely to share when they don't feel like they're going to have a huge follow-up after. Another important detail that he pointed out with assessment tools is that assessments will technically do a better job identifying who won't complete suicide, but versus who would commit. So they can identify the who more than likely won't, but it's hard to identify who more than likely will. And it's not like a all or nothing one of those ways. So there's space in between. They also said that, and overall the accuracy is low on both, but they're more likely to identify who won't. The screenings that they do will also help identify who is thinking about suicide, but they seem to have no effect on who will go through suicide. So again, the predicting who exactly is going to fall through on suicide is very hard, and warning signs do not guarantee follow through. Like these warning signs I mentioned before, you can have all 9 and you'll be fine sometimes. And sometimes people course correct, so they start showing warning signs and then they're able to fix it quickly, and so we don't even see the sign to begin with. However, there's a really interesting piece of data that he talked about on social media analysis, because we can look at people who have died by suicide and look at their social media posts leading up to that point and see if there are any clues, and there were, which is fascinating to me. But he essentially said that social media analysis of those who committed suicide did show predictive warning signs. The closer and closer to suicide someone got, they were more likely to be describing stressful life situations, followed by negative thoughts and expectations. That said, overall, there was no notable difference between posts of those who killed themselves and those who didn't. It was only noticeable in retrospective, but can't effectively be predicted. So what that meant is that a lot of people who did die by suicide, they saw an increase of negative thoughts and expectations. However, when they tracked other accounts that also had that increase, not everyone is killing themselves. So there is that correlation, but that doesn't mean they're going to. So of a lot of the people who did follow through, there was this trajectory of things got worse, but a lot of people who got worse didn't do anything. So again, predicting who exactly, very, very, very hard. Now, he also mentioned that suicidal predictors and accuracy in assessing them to increase when people deviate from their typical patterns. But those who have typical warning signs consistently and are deviating are less predictable. Consistent and predictable behavior seem like a decent predictor in non-suicidality. So what that meant is if you're often a negative person and you start having really positive shifts in your perspective on life, that could also be an indicator too. So one of the best indicators of non-suicidality was consistent and predictable behavior. And so if you're taking care of yourself well and you're behaving similarly and you're relatively predictable, your chances were lower. And it seems like they were lower than if you were always a down person and you got really up and happy on life. Like, that's not a warning sign necessarily, but that would be worth like making sure that person is on a good, healthy trajectory, and not, this is why people say, hey, when people start getting nice all of a sudden and start, giving away their stuff, you should be aware. That might be some of where that suicidal prevention and thought has come from. And he concludes the chapter by really emphasizing that we might do better to move away from trying to predict who will commit suicide and instead moving towards an understanding of what the predictive signs are. And he uses a really good metaphor around weather forecasts. So a lot of weather forecasts, we see it all the time. There's a percentage of rain, percentage of storms. We're seeing this system move this way. Same with people, of looking at like, okay, these are bad signs. We don't want this to happen. We need to move away. Or this is the warning signs of this, or this is how we predict that this might happen. And focusing more on preventative measures based on predictions, like the weather system does, which has gotten better. I know people complain about it a lot, but that's a really good example to use because weather prediction is pretty impressive. So I think it was a really, really good argument that he makes for how to be moving in a proper direction. So to further on with this predictive piece in chapter 4, which is, there's not a lot of chapters, this isn't going to be like an hour-long thing. He makes an argument that it may be more helpful to learn how to course correct quickly than, again, try to fully eliminate this. So what he would call like a tipping point approach. So as people start to escalate, to bring them down quickly and teach the people themselves how to de-escalate their own moments. And he did describe this as exponential. So a lot of people, they hit this tipping point really fast and don't notice it. In this statistic, and I didn't document the exact study except for the outcome, but they had these all or nothing moments. And he reported that 4 out of 10 people, 40% of people, made a decision to kill themselves within 5 minutes of acting on that decision. So that would be if you had the thought of, I want to die and I'm going to kill myself, that 40% of those people will do so within 5 minutes. You think about that escalation. If someone were to leave my office, or you're hanging out with a friend and an hour later they're dead, that's fully in line with what's happening here. And that doesn't mean I or you as the friend should have seen things before because of how fast it can escalate. The issue is, are we paying attention to making sure people we care about are taking care of themselves, generally speaking, because that'll prevent this issue. It'll help prevent it. So another study showed that 50% of people decide within 20 minutes of the actual attempt. So, depending on how you look at timelines, pretty close statistics. Suicidal ideation to action is highly exponential. We've talked about that, but the rate of rapidity, as they would call it, is just, it goes through the roof. People will act on it really quickly, and they'll escalate to different stages on the non-suicidal to suicidal spectrum. And wherever you're at in there, that doesn't mean you're about to. But oftentimes when you hit a certain point, it'll go quickly, and someone can be fine today, and then tomorrow they'll look 50% closer, and then within an hour of that moment, they're there. So just something to keep in mind. Risk reduction from suicide intervention is not the same as risk elimination. That's important to note. And then emotional distress is not equal to mental illness or mental health issues. That's 100% true. Like, grief is emotional distress, but it's not, you're not unhealthy to grieve. That's appropriate. Or if someone breaks up with you, you're not mentally unhealthy, you're probably really sad. So chapter 5, he uses a lot of really good arguments in here as well. There's a lot of good arguments, a lot of good metaphors. I like a good metaphor, and this is chock full of them. So yeah, there's a lot of good stuff in here. He continues to talk about this current model having a lot of limitations, which I really, really agree with. There's a lot that limits the current model of understanding. One point, he said that if interventions that are known to be successful have a period of not being as helpful, then suicidal individuals are more likely to drop the tool, even if they know it usually works. So this is why stacking successes is really important. And like, if you have experienced something not working, you're less likely to continue. an example is like a friend who didn't answer their call once. You might be like, oh, they're never going to answer again. Or the front desk person at the store or your gym or wherever was really mean. And you're like, oh, she's just a mean person. And because of the last time, but it's not consistent. And that thinking is not helpful too. So trying to eliminate that kind of thinking is important as well. He also pointed out that suicide-focused treatments that focus more on thoughts have more research backing them. Things like CBT, DBT, CBTSP. These have more research. Doesn't mean they're the best, but they have a lot more research than other approaches do. There's a lot of reiterating things that I've talked about and the book's already talked about, but a big takeaway is just there needs to be new adoption of tools to help with this process more for caring for suicide, and bigger focus on assessment and analysis and treatment from a reduction point of view versus an elimination point of view. So he gets into a concept that I might not dive into fully here, but one of them is approaching suicide the way we've approached car accidents. And so people will die from car accidents, right? And the fastest way to reduce that is to eliminate cars. That's not going to happen. We also can't just eliminate suicidality. So one of the next best steps is to integrate a system and for these are elimination, substitution, engineering controls, administrative controls, and personal protective equipment. It's like a general, I didn't write down the exact formula that is, but it's a common way to assess problems and manage them. So for cars, it was things like seatbelts, improved traffic signs, improving the cars in general, the brakes, the overall safety, making safer laws, all these things that make the car experience safer. Similar for suicide, making the person's life safer, giving them more tools and resources to have self-care and to have the people around that they need and to have access to things that they need. And overall, and this is how it transitions into the final chapter, is just focusing on making lives more worth living. Some interesting statistics were that he said that state minimum wage decreased suicide rates, so livable wages, suicide rates went down. Having health insurance reduced suicidality. Creating new perspectives on one's life and future, so believing that things can be good and that we don't have to feel bad, that helped. Basic self-care again. All these things is quality of life will reduce suicidality. And then I just have a ton of notes on things for me, but if I learned anything from this video is I need more time, but and a more succinct way to approach this, but hopefully you can get an idea of where I'm going with this in the general summary that I was offering at the end there. Quality of life will help reduce suicidality. General self-care, mental health care, and overall ability to be emotionally in control and reduce emotional distress will reduce suicidality. Interventions that are more cognitive and thought focused will help a lot, but there is still a lot of research that is needed for this. I strongly encourage everyone to go read this book, whether you are a clinician or just a person who's interested in the topic. It's a very helpful book. It's Rethinking Suicide, How Prevention Fails, Rethinking Suicide, Why Prevention Fails, and How We Can Do Better by Craig J. Bryan. Fantastic book, highly recommend. Go give it a read.